Hello and welcome to Connoisseur Conversations with our wonderful hosts, a.lange and Söhne. My name is Peter Wallman and we're in this wonderful room at the Villa d'Este here on Lake Como on a beautiful sunny day. We've got some very, very exciting guests for you. First of all, we have Mr. Ian Cameron, who is the former head of design for Rolls-Royce motor cars and also a member of the judging panel here at Villa d'Este. Welcome, Ian. Good to have you with us today. And of course, a face which is very familiar to all of you and to me, Mr. Wilhelm Schmid, who is of course CEO of a.lange and Söhne.
Thanks, Peter.
Good to see you, Wilhelm.
Always good to see you.
Our subject for today's Connoisseur Conversation is the excellence of timeless design. And I think this room fits the bill very nicely. So Ian, I'm going to start with you. I just want to talk a little bit. You know, it's quite a difficult question, but what is a design classic to you? What does timeless design mean? For me, I'm just going to say, when you put it into the context of cars, I think it's the use of traditional materials, you know, wood, leather, traditional paint, lots of chrome. That's where I see sort of timeless classic design. But when you get into modern materials like carbon fiber and plastics, are these timeless design statements for the future?
Well, of course, I have to reply initially and say it's a hugely complex question. So, you know, asking how much time we have. But to be serious, first of all, everybody thinks or hopes they will do timeless design, but who knows? That only the future will tell you that. But you're quite right in terms of the materials. These are absolutely critical signals, messages, etc., etc. But I think what you have to realize is design is much more than just the form and the color material. In German you say Gestalt. It's what is behind the creation of this object that we're looking at. And I think it really starts with the values that associate, the values that drive it, and that must be authenticity. And when you start to look back and consider a brand has a lot to do with it, what brand it is, and all these things start to feed in like a recipe.
Yeah.
But what you do with the ingredients is, you know, open to the gods and open to a lot of input, processes, partners. I always like to think, well, I'm quite sure and I know that design is not down to one individual, in spite of what some people like to think, but it's very much a team, like an orchestra.
Sure.
So when you think of how music comes out of a jam session where there's just confusion and notes, but suddenly symphonies start to appear, a rhythm starts to appear. It's the same thing. And I think that at the end is what adds up to authentic, timeless design, if it works, if the ingredients are right, if the way you use these tools that you're in your hands is what works or doesn't work at the end.
Well, Wilhelm, you of course like to have time on your hands, and very nice it is too. Tell us, in your view, I mean, you're a great car enthusiast and you have your own cars, of course. What does timeless design mean for you?
I agree a lot, you know, we all try to do it, but only time will tell, because it's actually not in our hands. However, if something is unique and in line with the promise, a brand for me is nothing more than a promise that you do. So if that promise and that object is aligned and it is sustainable, and I think sustainability is a good word in many regards for timeless design, because if eventually somebody can't or a car can't be maintained, then timeless design is over because it's becomes stationary. A watch that can't be served becomes an object, but not a watch anymore. So I think, you know, authentic, uniqueness, recognizability, that's three components for me that go into timeless design. And if you have the right mixture of it, you know, you may have something which will survive the odds of time or the taste of time, which is also important to understand.
So, as you know, we've talked before, I like to try to find a little bit more about the soul of the item, but also of the brand. But I think what you're both saying, it really is about the human element in this. It's about the ethos of the brand, how that extends to the team that works on it, and how that is seen in the product range itself. But then, does timeless design have to be beautiful, or can it also be functional?
Oh, that's not a conflict. Absolutely not. Actually, above all, it's got to be attractive.
Yeah.
And next to being attractive, it must be understandable. It can't be confusing or bewildering. And I think sometimes you try too hard. Again, it's like music. There's got to be a spontaneity, an intuitive line that runs through it that's understood. Otherwise, you lose the customer, you lose the audience.
But I like what you said, your analogy with music, because I enjoy listening to jazz, and I think sort of hard bop, bebop goes into free jazz.
Yes.
And there reaches a point where the music is for the benefit of the musicians only, and I think design probably has that similar parallel where you reach a point where art and design is purely for the artist and the designer.
Yeah.
But in your world, you have a role which makes it appealing and attractive to an audience which is willing to buy into that ethos and design.
Yeah, and similarly in music you have, I'm not sure what the word is in English, an earworm. Do you know what an earworm is? Where there's a tune that you can't forget, it keeps coming back to you. It's the same thing in design. There's something there that appeals over time. Why? You know, clearly beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but there's something there that draws you back every time, and it's just like this airworm, you know. And is there a recipe for achieving that? No, there isn't.
And I think that, you know, that makes me think that when we talk about cars, we talk about watches and what the appeal is, it's that tactile quality as well. And
Absolutely.
that tactile quality comes from the design process then, is what you're saying. If you look at a great sculptor, it's touch.
Yes.
It's all about feeling, and I guess you get that feeling from the clay model. Because I was going to ask whether, you know, we looked at the speed tail and the boat tail, which we have, the boat tail 2 we have here, and I was watching a video and it shows the design process and it shows that they still sculpt a clay model. And I was wondering, is that necessary today? Is that for the benefit of the buyer to show that you've been through that process? Or is it really still needed by the designer and the creators of this to actually feel that emotion, that emotional attachment to what they're creating?
Absolutely needed by the designer. Not only the designer, I think the whole team,
Yeah.
the whole orchestra needs to understand this thing and mull over it and see what could be better, what could not be better. But in any case, you can always tell there's an element there of hand execution, which is not in a digital process. Maybe the market, maybe the product doesn't need it. Who cares? It's not timeless. But if you want to achieve that sort of finesse, I think absolutely it's essential. And above all, you gain time. You stall the process. And, you know.
Well, I watched this wonderful movie about Giacometti, the sculptor, and the way he was creating his sculptures and stepping back, coming to them and just keep revisiting. And I guess, Wilhelm, in the design of a beautiful watch, there's a tactile element to that, of course.
I totally agree with what you say, because we have that time gladly. We can take that time,
can
and
help
we will
us.
not release a watch or not even start presenting it to our shareholders until we think this is it.
Yeah,
and there is
absolutely.
a huge, you know, I always call it the gold washing process. You know, you dig in and you see a bit of gold, but you also see a lot of rubbish. And it takes an experience to get the rubbish away to keep the gold. And that's our design process. So, you know, we have an idea, and then, you know, the idea will materialize two-dimensional. We have all the 3D construction programs and all that, no doubt. But, you know, there's that element of when for the first time we have our dummies.
Yes.
And then the right material, and you have no idea how often we change decoration. And it looked great, three dimensional in a scan, or even two-dimensional on a paper.
It's nothing
but
like
then
that,
you have it, and you see, now you have it around your wrist, and you see something not right.
Yes.
And it's people don't understand, it's millimeters or fractions of a millimeter of an indice, which is too long or too small, which will make a dial look beautiful or not. And I also agree it's a team, because it's, again, many people that look at
absolutely.
it. And only at the very end you have what looks like somebody with a great idea woke up in the morning and said, that's it. But it's a process. And time is a very important ingredient. If you rush it, you usually get something which no longevity. Even it looks beautiful. Beautiful, by the way, is often a killer for longevity.
Yes,
Something that is immediately beautiful is
absolutely.
often very quickly mainstream, common,
Or just boring, just not interesting.
Boring.
Yes.
So, and all that is process. And I can remember, or do remember, whatever we do, at the end we take a dial, for example, which is the face of a watch, and take our logo away.
Yeah.
Just to see whether it's still a.lange und Söhne. You know,
Interesting.
because a logo will immediately say
Yes.
it's, but you take the logo away and you see, you have all your watches that you have in mind, and you look at it, and then that's the moment where you say,
Absolutely,
you can take the logo away and somebody will say, that's a.lange und Söhne.
Yeah.
Then you know you're there.
Well, I'm going to finish with one final question. What's your timeless design classic? I mean, it doesn't have to be a car or a watch. It could be a mocha coffee machine. I don't know. Do you have something that springs to mind, Ian?
There are lots of things that spring to mind, and I'm, of course, as a car designer, I love supercars and all this sort of stuff. But it's the daily product with which we're all familiar that, to me, is the greatest achievement of timeless design. If this is such a thing that exists, I love, for example, the 60s Fiat Cinquecento. It's such a charming little car. Why is the design so appealing over time? I don't know. The Alphas from Pininfarina and Bertone from the 60s and 70s, the BMW CSL from the 70s. These are timeless designs that always appeal year after year, year after year. I cannot define why, but equally as industrial design, it has the same charm to it. Some things, they're watches, clearly, without saying any names, but they're simply, you can't do anything better. They're simply there.
Well, they're the cars that when you close your garage door, you give them a name and you know that they'll bring a tear to your eye if you ever have to sell them.
You want to see a doctor about that.
I have many times. Wilhelm, do you have something that you can nominate as a timeless design classic for you?
For me, it's a.lange one. I know I'm a bit biased, and I accept that, but you know, I wouldn't sit here without that watch. Glashütte wouldn't be on the plate without that watch. You know, today that's a little village which gives more work than in the communist time to people. Without the a.lange one, it wouldn't be there. And after 28 years, it's an unchanged design. Not changed a single thing other than the movement 5 years ago. And it's still our bestseller. You know, that's very hard to find, a product life cycle over that period of time, and it's still appealing. It's still going from strength to strength. I'm biased, I accept it, but for me it's the a.lange one.
Thank you.
What about you, Peter?
I'm going to finish off by I'm going to finish off just by saying
A Riva.
I believe a Riva boat for sure is definitely you know, for me. Again, being a car enthusiast, an E-Type Jaguar for me is one of the most beautiful timeless designs, and you know, I've owned one for 35 years or 33 years, and I still feel my pulse race when I see one. But I'll finish off just by saying, to your point about, you know, quartz versus analog, I think the point really is that all of our wives, I believe, forgive our inaccuracies for our beauty. So we'll end on that note. Ian Cameron, thank you so much for joining us. And,
my pleasure, thank you.
Wilhelm, of course, always lovely to see you. Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.